Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode 2 of our podcasting series, where we are going over each of our projects in more detail than the intro video. If you haven't seen the intro video, go watch it. It'll be like the first uploaded video to this channel, and I will link it below. Today, we are going to be talking about the world of Atnia, or name is a little up in the air, but it's centered around Atnia. So I, Ski, am here with Kiavin, and he's going to take us through the world of Atnia.
Yeah, so Atnia is the setting for the tabletop role-playing we're working on, the card game we're working on, as well as just like stories and maybe like other podcasts that we're going to do kind of diegetically in the universe. So it's just where we're setting a lot of interesting things. So I'm really excited to introduce this. This is my first time kind of getting to kind of do a general overview of a lot of the details of this universe. So first thing is I'm going to read you kind of part of a poem which might help you get some of like the vibe of this region. Aton stands where dragons fell, where stones can speak and ogres dwell. There is a place old powers roam, hidden deep neath root and loam. Tomb of ancients, hall of bones, first king and queen here made their thrones. And so yeah, when Ski says that Atnia is sort of like the center of this world, it quite legitimately kind of is of the history, at least in this region of this universe. There are like ancient ruins from the Alva, an old civilization all around, and the societies here are kind of built in those ruins. Their languages are semi-based on the old Alvan language, and people think that this was maybe like some old race of elves that lived all around here. And for hundreds of years, civilizations built up. The world grew into kind of this magic, technologically advanced era. And then recently, under 100 years ago, there was a great collapse. And now, sort of, the world is set in the ruins of the old kingdom of Atnia, which was sort of at the center of all of this stuff, where people are divided into much smaller societies based on where they had to gather to survive.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting world, and it's going for a very specific vibe, but before we get into that, I think we should go over some of the people that exist within this world. Tell us about, like, who lives here.
Yeah, so for the past 80 years, so this great magical apocalypse happened. There was a great sort of light show in the sky and a battle of light and darkness above in the clouds, where it appeared, at least, that darkness wins. People can't contact the gods anymore, and monsters and demons roam the roads. And so everyone's kind of been living in their own little sort of siloed places that they've needed to stay in to survive. And even though they were all part of the same nation before, they've developed these very independent, different cultures. And just now, like sort of 80 years after this great apocalypse, the roads are growing safer, they're encountering each other again, and discovering that they're almost totally different peoples. So some of the major sort of civilizations that are now in the ruined kingdom of Atnia, one is the Old Watch. So on the night of the apocalypse, in this fortress in the mountains, there was a peasant revolution. They revolted against their noble masters and ended up building this civilization that's kind of this highly legalistic sort of semi-communist democracy where that just like highly values labor, is very sort of intense in what its laws are because and very superstitious about nobles and both nobles and magic, who they believe sort of caused the apocalypse and all of this terrible stuff. On the flip side, and so this is kind of like your very classic like low fantasy setting. Like they're against magic. They actually like train people to fight against magic. They work with some magical people sometimes, but for the most part, like it's you can kind of picture it as these very classic low magic fantasy villages because they don't allow any magical stuff within their walls. Sort of the flip side to them is the Knights of Redemption, which exist nestled kind of in this lake in the middle of the mountains on the very far side of the kingdom of Atnia. And they're founded by a noble and like several great heroes who save people after the apocalypse. And they're basically trying to restore the old kingdom of Atnia and claim themselves to be the closest successors to the true Atnian line. So the Knights of Redemption wield both like divine and arcane magic. Even though you can't contact the gods, they manage to draw magic from the relics that remain in this world, and also use the power of kind of this magic that a lot of people think caused the apocalypse to supplement it. And they're kind of split up into all of these various orders of knights, their political factions, kind of this very classic high fantasy, high drama with like knights competing against each other.
Now, the Old Watch, from my understanding, was actually the original place where this world started to exist and is kind of meant to be one of the main, like, kind of default place to start your adventures in the tabletop RPG. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I wanted to give people like more options of different fantasy settings that felt like different once this started becoming its own cohesive world. But yeah, the Old Watch was the initial impetus for this. I think some people who are involved in the project since the beginning still just call the universe the Old Watch because it's where everything started. But yeah, it's kind of moved on and expanded from there. But it's very close to my heart, and the Old Watch politics are very sort of central to like the vibe that I had at the start of the idea for this universe. One of the things that I wanted to be like very sort of central to your exploration of the universe. We're going to get into this later when we talk about how the structure of play is supposed to be, but I wanted this universe to feel more open than a lot of RPGs, and that's part of where like the mechanics come in. And so when I dive into talking about the mechanics, you'll see how this kind of differs from like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. Is that I don't want to prioritize like combat or anything above like any other mechanical thing. Like it should be fun and interesting to build your character around like doing politics. And that's true in any of the factions, that you can go out and be an adventurer, but I want this to be a world where it feels safe to, like, if you start as an adventuring party but then get super invested in the politics of the Old Watch or wherever else, you might just like settle down and engage with that instead. Or you could even just build an entire campaign set in a single location, and that would be a valid way to enjoy this world, I think.
My understanding of the Knights of Redemption is that there's very few of them and they're spread very thin, but because they take a long time to like train up their new members, but once they're there, they're kind of like these very powerful knights that are able to like single-handedly defend entire like communities in a way, right?
Yeah, again, it is the flip side to the Old Watch. If the Old Watch is kind of like your very classic, like low fantasy setting, Knights of Redemption is high fantasy with like larger than life heroes that are incredibly powerful, stacked up against incredible odds, and that's everything about the vibe of that place. And so, if you want to play a Knight of Redemption, like a lot of your themes and stuff are going to be basically like you're constantly going to be stuck like biting off more than you can chew, but with all of these sort of fantasy powers at your disposal, very classic like high politics. There's a sort of venerated, almost like god status queen above you that everyone sort of works with, but then all of these orders of knights under her that are all competing for political standing and different goals.
Speaking of the kind of queen of the Knights of Redemption, do you want to talk a bit about Eudoxia and the lore there, or do you want to save that for maybe a future story?
I might save some of that for a future story. I guess I'll just say in the like simplest terms that a long time ago, or during the apocalypse, Eudoxia and two of her friends basically saved a lot of people and actually created this entire lake in the middle of the mountains and rose up land in the middle of it to create their capital to save everyone using their incredible magical powers. But slowly they started dwindling. Her friends, including her wizard husband, end up dying, and she's getting older. And it seems as though with these few heroes to protect the to protect this like new kingdom of Pax Nova, the Knights of Redemption just aren't going to be big enough to persist. But for whatever reason, divine miracle or something else, Eudoxia has survived for 80 years. So this is the same queen that founded this little kind of new country, and she's still alive 80 years after the apocalypse.
Yeah, and there's maybe a bit of something fishy going on there. I guess we can say it that much. But I believe next.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to say something there?
Oh yeah, just there's reason to have suspicions. Yes, she's probably like 130 at this point.
All right, I believe next up is the Salt Alliance. As far as I can tell, a bit of a, I'd say fan favorite, but there's not very many fans of any of this stuff at this point. But the few people who have engaged with the factions in the lore have quite liked the Salt Alliance on a personal level. So I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to like maybe explain them.
Yeah, so the Salt Alliance is in some ways like the oldest faction because it was kind of it was a faction before the apocalypse. So the Knights of Redemption like claim successorship to the kingdom of Atnia, but like it's debatable as to whether they're still the same lines of kings and queens. Like Eudoxia is like a third cousin of the noble line and is basically like the closest successor to the kingdom of Atnia that anyone can find. The Salt Alliance has basically continued unbroken since before the apocalypse. It was originally a resistance movement of some of the indigenous peoples of Atnia, as well as like barbarians, bandits, deserters from the military that hid out in the mountains. And it was kind of based around like supply control. So it's called the Salt Alliance because the thing that they used to have leverage over Atnia whenever they could was access to salt from the outside, because there's not really close access to salt actually in Atnia. And so they would control the flow of salt into Atnia and use that to try and support their resistance efforts and stuff. So of all the factions, they're actually doing better after the apocalypse because the Atnian military is just completely shattered. They're no longer having to hide out from them, and they're already used to hiding in the mountains. So the existence of monsters that are like less organized, I guess, and less like specifically hunting them than the Atnian military was, is ultimately a boon in their favor. So they're this really interesting cultural melange because they're in the Atnian Valley before it was kind of colonized by the kingdom that's there now. It used to be there used to be like a lot of different cultures that had that existed in like kind of smaller tribes. They had like these very specific sort of like pseudo warfare rituals where every summer they would engage in like air quotes wars with their neighbors to determine what their borders were, but these wars were mostly like non-lethal. They have this norm, I guess, of carrying around what they call a sharp blade and a clang blade. And so these clang blades are these giant, like hulking weapons. Kind of. So some of these are like a lot of these people are like orcs and other things, but like and goblins and ogres and stuff. But also humans are involved in this culture as well. And it's kind of these stereotypical like giant gross looking orcish weapons that you think of as incredibly deadly, but the reality was that these weren't useful for like killing people. They were meant to like hit someone else's weapon in a kind of sport. And so these clang wars, you would kind of just like try and hit each other's giant weapons and knock each other over, and it was kind of a mix of like finesse and strength and more of a competition than literal warfare. And so they kind of engage in that again. But rather than occupying the valley, they also occupy sections of the mountains. One of the, I guess, common traits is most of these cultures that are surviving are not in the central Atnian valleys because that's where it's the most dangerous. So almost everyone has been pushed out to like the mountains or the plains on the edge.
Yeah, so the Salt Alliance, when the kind of Atnian government of the pre-apocalypse came around, they were effectively revolutionaries against it in a way, right? Like they were kind of just like a band of all the different cultures that didn't like the Atnian kingdom and all of its kind of questionable practices, and they used their control over the salt trade in order to have leverage over the Atnian government so that they wouldn't be just completely wiped out. Now, what is actually so important about salt in this setting?
Well, salt is important everywhere. You kind of need it for your nutrition, and historically, it's been like really difficult to access. Like access to salt was a determining factor in like the Americans, like as recently as the American Civil War, and has been through a lot of history. So it's just like required for your nutrition, and getting like large amounts of salt to feed an army and stuff can turn into something like very difficult. And the Salt Alliance basically had access to the mountains. So Atnia is like a very defensible nation. It's surrounded on like most sides by mountain and by sea on another side. And so by gaining control of kind of these access points on the edges of Atnia, they could try and limit the flow of different types of supplies by this is also like kind of a historically classic thing, is that a lot of resistance movements to governments and stuff have tended to hole up in the mountains where they could then ambush trade routes and things, like as they would try and move through mountain passes. And so that's largely what the Salt Alliance did pre-apocalypse. A lot of them were actually just the original inhabitants of Atnia before it was colonized, and so they just kind of became resistors by default because they didn't want to lose their culture to the new laws that Atnia was sort of magically imposing on the land. But also this just includes like deserters and revolutionaries from who were part of the new Atnian culture.
Do you want to talk a bit about the magical laws, or should we finish with the set different factions first?
Yeah, I'll talk about this briefly because it does matter a lot, sort of the bones of the kingdom that this is set in. So Atnia was like in many ways considered to be like one of the most advanced civilizations before the collapse and everything kind of fell apart. And one of the things that made it so advanced was it had this magical network of laws enforced everywhere, all across the kingdom, and technically like legal equality for everyone. Like there were nobles and peasants, and there were sort of different privileges that nobles got, but there was a sort of magical equality under the law, and it was considered to be sort of like a morally advanced nation in some ways.
Yeah, one of my jokes about this was that their entire kingdom ran on Ethereum smart contracts, and just the idea of
Yeah.
magically enforced contracts and laws that are impossible to break is kind of interesting, because you can imagine that, like, being physically unable to break the law is a bit different than just like, oh, well, there might be trouble if you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that affects like a lot of the politics of the world. Like one of the things that's so being physically unable to break the law, I guess it's a lovely idea, right? That everyone is equal under the law, it's magically enforced, it's equal, but of course the reality is that it isn't exactly. And so the Old Watch was actually meant to be like an example of where that kind of breaks down. So the Old Watch existed like on the very border of Atnia, technically outside of the enforcement of its magical laws, and it was used basically by nobles who wanted to exist outside of Atnian laws for a while. And sometimes that would be to just like do illegal drugs and stuff like that. But sometimes that would also be to be really horrible to their peasant servants in ways that they couldn't be elsewhere. And so that's kind of why there was that peasant revolution as stuff started to break down, is that it was one of the places where people were treated the absolute worst because nobles are the only ones who are actually going to have access to the loopholes in the magical structure of the law a lot of the time.
Now, post-apocalypse, has much changed about the magical laws? Are they still kind of being enforced on their own, or have they sort of fallen apart?
They've fallen apart a lot. They're enforced unevenly. This is something that I'm not gonna, I think is a subject of maybe another video, but the deeper you get into the center of Atnia, the more laws are intact. The cities on the outside, the laws are mostly broken, but you may find things like a door that still, like, it's illegal to open unless you have a specific passcode and it's magically enforced or something like that. And then more and more laws you'll find as you get closer to Pax Nova, and no one really knows anyone who's, or it's not Pax Nova, Pax, the like central capital city, and no one has actually like knows anyone who's actually made it into Pax, where it seems like a lot of the magical structure is still alive, and it seems to almost be hanging out of time. Like the central clock tower of Pax is just hanging in the air, split in half from the apocalypse, and you can see it from a distance, but no one's actually like been there. So yeah, and then in addition to that, there are also arbiters. So the arbiters used to be the people sort of in charge of enforcing the laws and stuff, and they still exist, like some of them, as well as there are like books lying around that can actually teach you how to become an arbiter, which is basically like a magical lawyer judge in this universe. And there's a pull for arbiters to repair the laws in Atnia. So there are some people actually trying to repair law in the country in order to ultimately maybe restore it one day.
Yeah, and these law mechanics, the arbiters, all of the people from these factions, the hope is to implement them into the card game. I've already done this with some of the factions, but this requires a good bit of cooperation and time to kind of come up with, like, what does it mean for a card mechanically to be an arbiter or to be a law? Like, for the laws, one of the main things that they are is they're kind of like these universal rules for all players once you play them. Sorry, I can't remember any of the cards that I have on the card sheet right now to give any examples, but yeah, next up we have the Fifth Legion.
Yeah. So the Fifth Legion is basically all that remains of the Atnian military. It's sometimes called the Cowards Legion because basically what happened is during the apocalypse, when the other legions were essentially being thrown into the meat grinder as demons were coming down from the sky, Pax was being raided, and all of this stuff, their commander just decided, you know what, we're just turning and running. We don't want to deal with this. And they're the only legion that actually made it out. There are some remnants of the first and second legions that have eventually joined up with the fifth, but the fifth is like basically the mass of survivors of the Atnian legions. For a while after the apocalypse, they were basically just a band of bandits, just as bad as the demons and monsters from the perspective of towns raiding them for food to stay alive. But since then, they've kind of had some changes in leadership, rebuilt to a certain extent, and offer the towns in their territory on the Burning Plains some amount of protection and actually fight the demons. But they have sort of a tenuous relationship with the villages in their region that both supply them and are their source of recruits these days. So they're kind of like, I guess if you want to talk about like different vibes, like the Old Watch is the low fantasy, Knights of Redemption is kind of the extreme of high fantasy. The Salt Alliance is sort of its own thing for people who wanted more of a focus on like monstrous races and things, like for people like me who always watch Lord of the Rings and we're like, okay, but like who does the farming for the orcs? Like, can we not have like a more of an orc culture that's like outside of their warriors? Which of course I know in Lord of the Rings they're like grown or something like that. But I wanted more orcs personally, and so this is for you orc lovers. Here's orc culture outside of murdering each other, and then the Fifth Legion is sort of like a fantasy, sort of fantasy military fantasy, I guess, where stuff is like kind of tightly controlled. It's a little bit more like war focused, where they're much like Pax Nova. Actually, they sort of think of themselves as the successors to Atnia, but in a different way. Like they're still the military, and they're basically trying to go back and like reclaim the lost cities and things. And so they're sort of at war with the hordes of monsters. And then a lot of their internal politics revolves around like whether the military should be more tightly whether the military should like more tightly control its subordinates or be a little bit more I guess kind of like liberal and allow more of a civilian government in the villages that it occupies.
Next up on the list of factions will be the Forsaken, which are pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, they're kind of the other fan favorite, I think, which is funny because the Salt Alliance and the Forsaken like sort of came later in the process. Like the Old Watch and the Knights of Redemption were the first two I made, but I think at least for the crowd that I play with, everyone's excited about the Salt Alliance and the Forsaken, which is understandable. They're very fun factions. So what the Forsaken are is basically the apocalypse happens, no one can contact the gods anymore, countries have collapsed, and the Forsaken go, wait a minute, isn't that a good thing? Shouldn't we be like happy about that? And so their stance is basically like the gods are either dead or have abandoned us, and we should actually like celebrate as opposed to being upset about this. So they're very focused on like dream and stuff. They have like a set of villages they protect, and they basically anytime there's like a disaster or monsters coming or stuff like that, they just like evacuate everyone into the dream world and stuff. And in order to do this, they've developed these kind of like very interesting norms and things to make anchors in the dream world for people to escape to. So they will often have like big festivals and parties with like really weird rituals, and the entire point of these rituals is to just have something really strange in your dreamscape to be able to like jump into and like link these villages together. Because like everyone, like no matter where they are in Atnia, they've experienced like this same thing of like a strange giant, like I don't know, like giant dandelion being set on fire or something like really random. And so since that is an anchor in all of their dreams, it's like closer in dream space, even if you're far apart in physical space. And that's how they sort of create their escapes. The actual members of the Forsaken are a relatively small group of people who are highly trained in like dream magic and all of this stuff, and they protect like a much wider group of, I guess, kind of survivors and also draw their recruits from it. Actual members of the Forsaken often choose like weird names to have in dreams and dress up in like very strange ways so that again you can have an anchor and like know that it's someone. So like you could have things like someone has exactly like 13 spikes on their hair and like 12 piercings or something, and because like dreams often like warp stuff, if you have a dream of that person, it'll usually show up different. And so when you encounter them in dream, you can actually like count these specific details in order to identify that this is actually the person you're talking to who is physically in dream, as opposed to just your dream of them. So yeah, lots of fun stuff like that.
I think we should go over a bit about the sort of dream realm, the Forsaken, the College of Dreams, just like what is the dream realm? Because I've heard of it as like a few different concepts that I'm not really entirely sure exactly which one we settled on, but my understanding is that it's almost like a kind of parallel dimension where concepts exist before being projected onto the real world, but at the same time, it's also almost a kind of space that is not physical, but it exists, and you can kind of create your own almost like pocket dimensions within it. Like there's the College of Dreams, which is basically like an entire city or campus that has been moved into the dream realm for, I guess, different reasons that you may want to get into. But this is like one of the interesting parts to me about part of the vibe is that it feels like a kind of fantasy version of the exploration of the concept of space. I don't know if you want to talk about the dream realm a bit.
Yeah, it does. It is sort of like that. So, like, when you have someone describe like gravity, and I don't know if you've ever like heard someone describe gravity, and they talk about like, oh, if you have a blanket and then you put like a bowling ball on it and you roll a bowling ball or like another ball around it, it'll sort of like orbit and then eventually like fall into the center, right? And so that blanket and the bowling ball is sort of like a metaphor for how weight and mass and matter warps reality, right? You can kind of think of the dream realm as if you were to take a blanket and shake it, and there are all of these ripples on the blanket, the motion of the ripples is almost what the dream realm is. It's sort of like the contour, and it's almost a question of like what's causing what. So I don't know if that's like coming across, but the dream realm is almost like a radio frequency, but also like its own sort of dimension on top of reality in this world. And so yeah, it is just like weird fantasy physics, I guess. And I guess the role it fills is, yeah, it's basically like it is just an entire world of concept. And one of the things about this universe is that like what life is it's matter and concept kind of both warped around each other into sort of like a whirlpool. So the matter, and so that basically like a single flow of concept remains in the same space for a while. And so, like, a living being has sort of a projection on the dream realm, and it's actually part of their biology in this universe.
And yeah, one of the ideas of the kind of places that will exist within the dream realm is that they don't really need to follow the normal kind of laws of physics or geometry in a way. Like, you could have non-Euclidean spaces, and maybe, like, one of the ideas I pitched for the College of Dreams was that, like, it's almost like an inside-out planet or globe where everything is built on the inside of a sphere that's holding out, like, the kind of space of the dream realm that within inside everybody's, like, kind of just safe in there.
Yeah. And so I guess we should talk a little bit about the College of Dreams. This is like a very weird safe space that you might dream of. There are actually high-ranking members of the college who are not aware that they're members of the college in their waking world. But basically, it's a bunch of physical locations, places that were designated to the study of dream magic, that during the apocalypse ended up being transported into the dream realm and all kind of shoved together into this strange sort of impossible city that's sort of spiraling in all directions. And its goals are like very strange. So to get promoted and be higher up in the college, you actually have to spend a lot of time in dream, which means that you get very used to dream logic. And so if you're like a lower ranking member of the college, what you're being told to do by higher ranking members might make almost no sense and like lose its connection to the real world. But yeah, it's a lot of people who are, I guess, kind of like living physically in sort of deep dream and interacting with it a lot. And they're very concerned with combating certain nightmares that they view as an existential threat to the world.
Yeah, and I guess we can zoom out a little bit more now and talk about the kind of feel of these different fractions as a whole, because one thing that's interesting to me, and you talked about this in the card game episode where we talked a bit about the lore and how it interacts with that, is it's meant to be a more nuanced universe. But I think there's something a bit deeper there, in that it's not just that individual conflicts or factions are nuanced, it is that the world exists and just all of these different groups and things exist within it, and they're not really like, none of them are really given a significant focus. Like, it's not about the Knights of Redemption and the Old Watch and whatever's going on there. It's about everything that is in here, and you can kind of zoom in on whatever bits you like and kind of engage with those.
Yeah, I think that's something that I really appreciated in some fantasy universes where I really like the sense that there's just like mystery and history around every corner. And there are some ways in which things like having a central conflict that like engulfs the entire universe, as much as that kind of exists in this world in the form of the apocalypse, but having like a very clear like, oh, we need to throw the ring into the fires of Mount Doom is, again, as much as I am a Lord of the Rings fan, that feels a little like a disappointing answer to me. Maybe there are a lot of little things that need to happen in the world if you want to make the world a better place, or maybe you could make the world a better place in your small local environment in spite of these horrible world-changing things happening. And that's kind of more the feel that I wanted, that everything in the universe matters, as opposed to like there being like some like central arc or something.
Yeah, and I think one of that kind of pushes us in the direction of almost ending up with populating the world with a sheer number of interesting things that you can kind of pay attention to, and it makes it feel more full and like there is a sense of mystery around every corner because there's always just like more to learn about the world. And obviously the people living in it don't know everything about it either because they've all been fractured off into different groups after the apocalypse. But like I'd be reading through the glossary to catch up on everything, and like I'll come across like the ink bloods, which are a kind of strange immortality project by the old king of or archmage of the Atnian kingdom, where he has created this kind of tower where it's filled with books that are written in ink that kind of infects people's blood, and it almost turns them into these drones that are kind of recreating each other until eventually they're just going to recreate a new version of Pyrrhus. And that was just like one of his weird attempts at immortality.
Yeah, and the other thing is that in the context of the RPG, like the Inkbloods are playable, and you don't have to be a mindless drone. It's just the more that you tap into your power, like if you get killed and resurrected by the power of the Inkbloods, Pyrrhus's, I guess, like beliefs and thoughts will start to seep further and deeper into your mind. And so if you want to play as one of these characters, like you could be like, oh yeah, like I kind of like a full patriot and want to be Pyrrhus, or you could be personally like sort of combating that, and that can be a personal struggle for your character, is trying to use your magical power without like destroying yourself.
Yeah, I find it personally very interesting to just kind of come across these really cool concepts and explore them.
Yeah, and so again, I will probably make a lot more lore videos at some point in the future because I have just tons of ideas in this world. And again, one of like sort of my core mission statements is there should be mystery around every corner, but every mystery should also have like some kind of explanation to it. So like anything that you go, huh, that's really strange. Like, why is that the case? You should be able to look deeper into it and like eventually find an answer. Like, I don't want to have a bunch of like sort of hand wavy things here, I guess.
I guess we should kind of start talking about the feel of the universe as a whole now that we've gone over some of the kind of major factions that are going to be like at least having the most visibility in at least the early explorations of the lore.
Yeah, so I think you brought up like Breath of the Wild, and you can talk about that more in a second. My initial like inspiration for stuff like this was really like from software games, so like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Elden Ring and all of that kind of stuff, and this sense of like, but I wanted something a little different, I guess. So what I really like about Dark Souls is that it feels like a D&D campaign in a broken, shattered world, and it feels like very true to kind of these classic fantasy vibes while also having its own twists. It feels dark, but also like strangely comfortable and nostalgic to wander through these worlds. It's sad, but it also has all of these sweet things. It's got a sense of humor to it, and I kind of wanted to capture all of that in mine. But one thing that I wanted to do a little bit differently, I think, from the classic like Souls games experience is I wanted it to feel a little more alive and vibrant with more people to talk to. Like, it's not just like that one weird guy with a funny laugh that you encounter at the bonfire, and then it's like a while away before you encounter another human being. I wanted it to feel a little more populated and lively while also having some of that kind of mix of like kind of like quiet, melancholy, dark feeling, but also just a little fun and funny too.
Yeah, so a specific aspect of Breath of the Wild that I really liked when I first played it when it released was the kind of chill post-apocalyptic vibe it had, where everything just felt so tranquil and you could kind of go around and see these different communities that have just like, they're not very big, but they've kind of created their own little uh, home after the apocalypse in different areas, and just so much areas of the world that aren't really like, they're not inherently dangerous, but they feel kind of wild, even though there is some semblance of roads and infrastructure that used to be there.
Yeah, man, I need to play Breath of the Wild because that's exactly the kind of vibe that I'm going for, where it's like the monsters have subsided a little bit. It's no longer like completely unsafe to travel the roads. Like obviously you should have a weapon and be ready to like run away or something like that, but you can just walk, and a lot of the time it's just calm and tranquil, and nature has reclaimed a lot of stuff that used to be city or roads, but the vestiges of that still exist, and there are still people kind of surviving in their little silos.
It feels very strange to be like almost having a kind of imagined nostalgia for a post-apocalyptic setting where realistically a lot of people have just fucking died, but it's almost kind of peaceful afterwards. It feels kind of strange to have that thought, but I don't know if that'll be like a common thing of people who have played these games that we mentioned or explored Atnia.
I think there's a reason a lot of this stuff kind of resonates with us. Like people are really in our generation, I think a little before, people have been getting really into like apocalypse stories, and for whatever reason, a lot of them don't necessarily draw to me in the same way. Like zombie story, apocalypse stories, or like some of these like big disaster movies and stuff, like don't speak to me quite right because they're all about like, I guess, just exploring the intensity of catastrophe, how other people can be so terrifying, and all of this stuff. But I think maybe that's not the best story to be telling, because maybe if we tell all of these stories about how we're going to be scary hoarders and shoot each other on sight, that's what we would do if something terrible happened. And and we should tell stories about like the problems and conflicts we might have as people, but also a little bit more, I guess, just like realistically, that we're people that are sometimes cool or sometimes really suck, and just kind of explore all of it at once. Like that's kind of what I'd like to see a little bit more in our apocalypse stories, and I think it really does speak to us because I think there's this anxiety that a lot of us have around like what the future of our world looks like, and so it does in some ways feel comfortable to spend some time just exploring it, and especially maybe in more of a chill way than like this dramatic, again, like, oh, we're all going to kill each other and it's all horrible. Like that could still happen in this universe. I don't want to like shy away from that, but I also don't want to make it like the focus in the way that like I feel like some zombie stories or whatever do.
Yeah, I think a major distinction is between like the kind of apocalypse stories that we're more interested in is during the apocalypse. Exploring that event itself is very, very different from exploring the aftermath. Like, this is taking place 80 years later. There's going to be some people who are still alive from back when it happened, but for the most part, these are the generations that are living afterwards. And what is going to be the sort of collective memory of these events in different cultures?
Yeah, and that was another thing that I really wanted to explore was like we're living in like a very globalized world where we all interact with each other and stuff like that, and but it's not a given that things will remain that way. And what happens when you're all connected and then all of a sudden it severs and you get the chance to all be different kinds of people, but also have to make different kinds of compromises with your own morality in order to survive. Like what types of people does that produce again all of a sudden? And those are exciting questions to me.
I guess suppose at this point we should maybe dive a bit deeper into the apocalypse itself.
Yeah. So I've mentioned this a little bit, but basically what happens during the apocalypse is all of a sudden there's this great flashing light above Atnia, sparks flying, and it seems like almost there's a dome of protection over the nation, but the light show just keeps trying to get in, and this lasts for maybe a week as you just kind of look up at the sky and there are just these great flashing lights. And then at some point, these portals open in the sky, and an army of darkness is riding above the clouds towards this open sort of gate to a kingdom of heaven, it looks like. It seems like very gods and demons are doing battle with each other above this light show going on. And some people think it's the end of the world. Some people think that the forces of darkness are finally going to be struck down, that there will be a great era of happiness again. There's also this like local drama that's going on at the time. This is not really talked about much after the apocalypse, in part because of how kind of like deified Queen Eudoxia is, but she's actually on the verge of being ousted by the church at that time for having semi-heretical views. So the Veriglass is like the major church in Atnia, and they don't accept as gods anyone that started as a mortal. So if you were born as a mortal, you might become an angel, but they don't think you can become a god that way. But it's very different from a lot of indigenous cultures, including a lot of orcs worship only actually mortals that have ascended to gods. And Eudoxia has a friend, Gacht, who is an orcish storyteller, kind of like a skald, bard sort of thing. And she's trying to get his god Zagagir, sort of a god of adventure and storytelling acknowledged by the church. And the church is about to kind of like oust her and her friends for that. And she's sort of leading these demonstrations. It's almost kind of this Joan of Arc moment where there's like, she has tremendous popularity already as a hero before the apocalypse, but the church is about to oust her. And then all of a sudden this happens and no one really knows what to do with it. And these three heroes end up, as they were previously sort of resisting, they were resisting the church. What ends up happening is as the apocalypse happens and the demons start flooding down, is they end up just protecting who they can and taking like almost the entire village of Mirkur, which was a church town that was on the verge of either protecting them or running them out, and they just end up protecting everyone and through their heroic might getting whoever they can to a safer place and using magic to kind of lift it up. At the same time in the Old Watch, during the apocalypse, the revolution is happening. Basically the distraction of monsters flooding over the mountains and other things. The Old Watch is like a walled city, so the peasants aren't really aware of what's going on. They just see the guards are distracted, and they use this as an opportunity to raid the palace. And the nobles essentially ring the bells, call for the guards to descend from the walls, but the guards realize correctly that if they do that, everyone is going to die, and so they ignore the cries of help for the nobles, and the peasants have a successful little revolution.
I believe the guards afterwards then were kind of really respected by the peasants because they didn't like try to stop their revolution. They just, did their job and protected the wall.
Yeah, so nobility is banned in the Old Watch. This happens, like, politically over a few years. Like, at first, the nobles that are defeated are allowed to sort of be a part of the new government, but eventually they try and reclaim power for themselves a few times and then all get exiled. And so ultimately, like, if you are a noble or like even show signs of nobility, so the Old Watch is like super anti like wearing jewelry and stuff or like holding gems or gold or anything like that, because it is kind of seen as this corrupting influence. And that's sort of why is in that transition. But the only people who are allowed to hold noble titles are the guards, because the guards of the Old Watch were actually noble. They were low nobility as opposed to like the high nobility that was being revolted against. And since they protected the village, they were basically allowed to remain in the village, remain and hold on to their nobility and actually even take pride in it. They just aren't allowed to vote or take any interest in politics outside of what is in the interest of protecting the walls. So they have to basically like swear an oath of disinterest in village politics. And so they're both sort of like an underclass in some ways, but also like an incredibly venerated underclass that like their words carry a lot of weight because they're seen as only being concerned with protecting the village above all else.
Yeah, one more thing that I would like to touch on that you mentioned, the gods in this world. How does being a god work? How do they come to exist? What sets them apart from other beings?
Yeah, so gods really are beings of concept. This is not something that's necessarily like known about deeply in the world by a lot of people, but because the Fairy Glass had a very sort of different view of it. But gods are born of concept, and they're essentially like these. When the dreams of a great many people coalesce together, they can give birth to a powerful being within the dream realm, and that's basically what a god is. So a lot of the gods that we know by face and name are not even the most powerful gods in this world, because there are some gods that are even older and are not named and are just like more based on sort of like feelings that every mortal being from a bug to a dragon has felt or some such thing.
And this gets a lot into the sort of past history of Atnia of long before the apocalypse. So maybe we want to delve a bit into that at this point.
Okay, yeah. So Atnia was the home of the great ancient Alvan Empire, which is commonly thought of to have been an empire of elves, and their ruins are everywhere. And this was basically seen as like the first civilization in the world. It was incredibly advanced. Their ruins extend all over, sort of spiraling out from Atnia around a lot of the landscape. And they eventually just kind of disappeared. So a long, long time ago, the Alva sort of retreated to their caves and groves, leaving people to fend for themselves, and that's when the first mortal kingdoms were formed in the wake of the Alva, initially claiming sort of successors to the Alvan Empire, but slowly sort of splintering through wars with one another. Long, long ago, there was actually another apocalypse when the first of these kingdoms started to collapse. It began through sort of a dust bowl, a period of starvation where crops started failing, and then this dark, fabled horned legion swept across the land and basically destroyed almost every little kingdom that was still clinging to life at the time. So named for having warriors with horns on its helms. It's often characterized as having been led by great ogres, and ogres are still often vilified to this day for their membership in the Horned Legion, although it was really members of all species were a part of this legion, and it's mysterious. The legion kind of swept across the land, destroyed kingdom after kingdom, and then disappeared into nowhere. And then this apocalypse, some even think is almost a successor to the old one, because the army fighting the gods, it contained demons, but it also contained people with great horned helms. And there's this question of whether the Horned Legion actually returned there for some dark purpose.
Yeah, I suppose. Do we want to get into the different species of this world at all?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so this is something that's like a matter of debate at this moment of like what all species exist. So I'll go through the ones that like definitely do. So there are humans who historically have actually been less in charge of kind of the great civilizations of the world. Only in this last era, so the Eighth Age, which is sort of the age of the Archmages, where magical science and technology sort of dominated the world, where humans sort of a dominant force in the planet. Previously, like a lot of the great empires had been led by ogres or goblins or orcs, depending. And so those are kind of the other major species that are everywhere. Ogres are purely carnivorous. They're much larger creatures than everyone else. They also live significantly longer and are often like very concerned with nature. They're stereotyped for sort of guarding a lot of these ancient ruins and providing riddles to travelers and then getting angry when the travelers solve the riddles and going berserk and attacking them. But this might not be the case if you were to actually encounter an ogre. That's sort of the dark stereotype about them. Orcs are kind of a lot of what you imagine when you think of fantasy orcs, but closer to sort of like newer D&D versions where they're not just like evil and stuff like that. One of the things that orcs have to deal with is they have very strong emotions that they can't help themselves from feeling. They're quick to turn to violence, but they're very slow to turn to killing because because they actually have to process like causing someone's death like immediately there. They can't like turn and hide from an emotion as it's felt. Goblins are very varied sort of lizard-like creatures. They are often have like a passion and a knack for invention. And in a lot of goblin cultures, they have sort of like a strong connection to insects, which they actually think of as another sentient species. And they are very convinced that if the other races would only try, they could talk to them. And they actually think that insects and humans are very close to each other, and they claim that both humans and insects get very mad when they say that. Um, but uh, but yeah, goblins also tend to have like cultural norms against like personally being leaders. They have this belief that being a leader is something that like puts you in danger and gets you killed, and what would actually be better is to be second in command of someone who's leading something useful. So goblins are kind of lackeys by choice a lot of the time. And then in addition to those species, there are waking dreams. So in the dream world can give rise to like sentient creatures sometimes that sometimes leave and come into the material world and become mortals. And these are often like kind of especially strange beings born of dream. So some elves, in spite of people thinking they're extinct, like actually exist, having walked out of the dream realm.
Yeah, one of the things that I quite like, and you alluded to before, is we're exploring a lot of the kind of quote-unquote monstrous races and giving them a bit of an alternative explanation that's trying to look more into what are these people's lives going to be like? What is really going on within their culture? Because just having like, oh well, there's the orcs and they're really mean, boo, that's kind of not very interesting, right? So a bit of a more nuanced picture and twists on the sort of typical expectations. And there's kind of a bit of a bigger twist that we're not going to spoil right now, but at some point will come up with one of these kind of groups.
Yeah, so the thing that I wanted to do was like give you a lot of sort of the tools of older fantasy lore, but with like a different sort of twist. So one of the things that I really like is, so I've been playing D&D for like a lot of my life, and I would always love, even as like a kid, just like flipping through the old monster manuals. 3.5 was the edition that I grew up with personally, if that speaks to anyone. And there'd be all of these like really cool like pictures of monsters and creatures and species and things. But a lot of the like quote unquote like monstrous species, it would be like, well, and they're all slavers and horrible and like murder people and things like that. And it's like, well, okay, but like, can we talk about like how cultures might form around like these like physical differences of things that are like significantly different from humans? Can it not just be that like everything in the monster manual is like a slaving murderer or something like that? Can we have something like more in depth? And so what I wanted actually was and I guess this is kind of getting into the world mission statement sort of thing, and also for the TTRPG, is that basically like sometimes you'll have like dungeon masters complaining that their parties don't want to fight anything or something like that. And I want it to be valid for you to approach this world like in any number of ways. And that's going to get into how the TTRPG mechanics are designed to encourage that, but also like how I write about monsters and other creatures in this world. Is that if a creature is fighting you, there's probably something it wants. And that's true of everything from a demon to a giant spider to an orc or a goblin or anything. It's always because they want something. It's not just because they're evil and they are bound to do evil things. And if you understand what something else wants, what its desires in this world are, you can probably reason with it. Maybe you're not in a position to do that at the moment, and that's not to say that there are like never going to be unavoidable fights. That happens in the real world too. It's just to say that there shouldn't be anything in this world that is just evil for the sake of being evil. If something is doing bad things, it has a reason to motivate it. And that's something that I want to be very kind of strictly stay to in building this universe.
That gets into this what this world means mechanically for playing these games. So I suppose we should go through the tabletop RPG a bit more if you want, or we can leave it at that, and then maybe move on to the card game and...
Yeah, okay. Let's go through the feel of I guess a few things. So for the tabletop RPG, I've already kind of alluded to the feel of certain elements. I want there to be mystery around every corner, and everything is interesting. So you can go and delve into the deep Alvan ruins, try and decode the Alvan language, understand the deeper history of this world back thousands and thousands of years, because it's all here in Atnia, the center of the ruins. You can maybe find why all of this happened from much, much longer ago, from before both this apocalypse and the last one, like thousands of years before it. Or you could just stay in one of these villages, and the mysteries that you're involved in are more local and personal, trying to understand how to heal the political relationships between the people around you. And that's kind of what adventuring in Atnia should feel like, that there's depth and complexity wherever you want to go. You could go and try and find your way into the middle of Atnia, understand what happened in the apocalypse, maybe get into Pax, the capital city that's been walled off forever, and figure out what happened there. Are there people still alive in there? It looks as though there's some kind of magical protection. Maybe time has been stopped in that city. Who knows until you go and journey there. And in addition to that, factions are finally making it out into the world again, and they're starting to encounter each other. And sometimes they'll be able to work with each other, and sometimes it'll be difficult because of their conflicting ideologies. The Knights of Redemption and the Old Watch in some ways are diametrically opposed, because the Old Watch hates nobility, and the Knights of Redemption are all sort of noble orders of knights. But the Old Watch has its own Knights on the Wall that protect them, and the Knights of Redemption actually would offer those Knights on the Wall a position in their court and government as legitimate knights. And what does that mean for the Old Watch? Would the Knights of Redemption eventually leave them? And those are... would the Knights on the Wall eventually leave them for the Knights of Redemption? And those are kind of all sort of like interesting political questions that might be explored. Or maybe the Old Watch will form an odd alliance with the Fifth Legion at some point. I think all of these things are possible because there are different sort of political forces in each of these factions that would be like, both incredibly opposed to each other, but also could find common ground. And you could see these kind of alliances and things lining up in different ways, and maybe your goal in playing in this universe is to be a diplomat and bring peace back to Atnia and get all of these groups to make peace with each other. I don't know. I think there's a lot of fun opportunities there. I guess I should also quickly say that these aren't the only groups in Atnia. They are just the largest. There are other interesting factions for you to explore and encounter, all dotted throughout the landscape, too. But I think the faction stuff is a great way to transition into the card game vibe, because I think a lot of that is also sort of captured in the card game. So in the card game, one of the things that we're trying to do, and I think we talked about this a bit in the more card game focused video, which I'm not sure will come out before or after this.
It'll be before.
Okay, yeah, so we talked about this a bit in the card game video about how there are these different sort of ideological anchors that everyone has, like Zelor being like emotion and storytelling and other things, and Eminus being your reputation and whatever. And all of these different factions sort of care about these different moral, emotional, or like physical currencies kind of differently to one another. And that's meant to represent the different points of common ground these factions might have. And so when you create your deck in the card game, one of the things is it should feel almost like a very reasonable alliance that you could have in this world, like maybe an actual army you could have, or if you're creating more of like a spell-focused deck, you might be a genuine spellcaster that has learned little tricks from around the world or something like that. Like, it should have a kind of a vibe that like battling between any two decks in this universe could be a diegetic thing that's actually happening in the world, is something that seems fun. And obviously, it's a card game. You can build your deck however you want, and you've kind of got to use your imagination to stretch and get there, but hopefully this will be a good sort of canvas for people like me who, when they play a card game like this, want it to feel like something that could, like some kind of battle or whatever else that could genuinely happen in this universe.
Yeah, I suppose I should tease one thing that I found interesting, which is possibly creating a card rule set for resolving combat in the tabletop RPG. I think that could be really neat. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about that in the actual tabletop RPG rules cast, which will be the third episode in this series. But do you have anything to say about that?
I guess yeah. Just so the tabletop RPG is already going to kind of use a card system, but not in the same way. Like actions are kind of given space and like rules on a different type of card. It's not like you shuffle up your deck and then you get to move stuff out. It's just for like convenience almost. Like I know people who are used to newer editions of D&D, you often have like all of your spells and abilities on cards. It's a little bit like that. But there's like a structure to it that should make combat or talking or whatever else like flow kind of conveniently. We'll get more into that into the rules system, but that could also be replaced with a system that actually uses the card game as its mechanics, and we're going to talk about some of our ideas for that, I think, in the next video, which is pretty exciting. So if you get excited about like building a deck or something like that, you might be able to even put together a kind of fun like I guess like role-playing deck.
So are we going... Next up is the just telling people to come world build with us, I guess. Do you want to do that now?
Yeah. So we're going to have a link to the Discord to come and join us, and just come and enjoy building this world with us. This is still a work in progress. There's still a lot to be fleshed out. There's a lot that's already here, and just come learn secrets about the world. We'll probably have a link to a wiki of like a lot of the major information here soon, and just have fun. Again, if you're interested in kind of getting in early on this project, making suggestions, if you're inspired by a part of the world and are like, there should really be this here, just come and let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Again, there are also like some very large like need to be done things in the world that are like massive projects that I could use help on. The one that keeps particularly coming to mind is the conlanging stuff, because like the history of language actually means a lot to this universe, and I'm a little out of my depth for some of it. So yeah, I'll do a language video at some point too for people who are interested in that. Covering like some of the languages of the world, how they've co-evolved, how they've morphed into one another, that sort of thing. And yeah, anyone who wants to nerd out over that kind of stuff, I'd love to hear some feedback. Yeah, and from there, I guess maybe it's time to move on and start talking about just like the rest of the mission statement that I haven't talked about yet. So like why this project is important to me.
Yeah, so I've set up a kind of wiki page through Obsidian and Markdown files. It just generates a site on GitHub Pages using a tool I found called Quartz. So if you want to just like write a Markdown document on a given detail about the world and send it our way, we can just add it to the wiki.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. And this world is going to be like so full of like depth and random things that like if you have an idea of like a village or some like random small group of survivors that fits the vibe, like this world should be vibrant and populated in all kinds of places. So write your stuff and let us know. That would be awesome.
And yeah, I guess next up we should get into the kind of overall mission statement. Why did you start with this project? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, let me actually find a quote, because this is like I actually, so here's a funny thing. I've been working on this since before I played Dark Souls, and just like someone was finally like, okay, you gotta go through and like play this. And there was a particular line in Dark Souls 3 that really captured kind of what I want to get out of this. So if anyone's familiar with Dark Souls, in Dark Souls 3, you actually go into a very sort of like meta painting that's clearly about the world. So it's like a magical painting that's very clearly like a meta story about the world itself. And there's this really pretty line in it that says, "I will assuredly finish the painting of a cold, dark, and very gentle place. One day, it will make someone a goodly home." And that's kind of like a core of the mission statement of this project for me, really. So what that's saying is that Dark Souls is meant to be a cold, dark, but also gentle, sort of comfortable place that can be a home for you. And that conversation is also in the context of talking about how this painting has made itself sort of a home for outcasts and people who don't necessarily feel safe. And so the first part of this mission statement is to create a dark but somehow comfortable fantasy world for anyone who needs a little bit of an escape from this one, who wants to imagine something different, not necessarily better, but comfortable, and it allows them to have a comfortable place to sort of explore themes or fears that exist in this world. So it's not gentle is an interesting term that Dark Souls isn't exactly gentle. It's dark, it's harsh, and yet there is something gentle about the way it kind of helps you explore nightmares, and that's kind of what I wanted here. So one of the names I have for this project, and probably what the name of the tabletop RPG is going to be, is Nightmares from the New World. And yeah, it's meant to be a sort of like safe, comfortable exploration of nightmare and dream, I suppose. It's meant to evoke a lot of fantasy nostalgia if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, Wizard of Earthsea, even like Full Metal Alchemist, things like that. This is kind of supposed to be somewhere where you can go and it'll feel very comfortable and familiar and yet different, and have I want there to be nuance and depth there, minimal hand waving, so that you can go and just sort of explore this universe infinitely at your leisure. And this strange sort of mix of hope and horror, a sense of constant mystery and discovery, that I hope it feels like a safe, fun, calm place for your brain to inhabit, even if it's also dangerous and scary, you know?
Yeah, I think that really fits with the type of games that we're making, because to me, a lot of what is engaging with card games that I like is that you can kind of just exist within not necessarily the world of the setting, but also the world of the mechanics, and just building decks on the internet, just thinking about the game when you're not playing it, and engaging with the game over the course of years, really getting to know what is really going on with it. I think that works very well with this concept of, I guess you can just finish that sentence because I can't think of the words.
So actually that brings me back to like two things that I almost forgot to say about both the tabletop RPG and the card game. So as far as the card game goes, another thing that I really wanted was like the sense of mystery to be all pervasive and everywhere. So like you can find little things about the universe anywhere, and that includes on the cards. So like when we're thinking about making card art, card mechanics, and flavor text on cards, you might get stuff in the universe that you wouldn't get in any of the tabletop RPG books, because I want it to feel like there are just like little nuggets to explore everywhere, scattered throughout, and that part of the fun is like maybe flipping through cards and then all of a sudden like a character that only exists on a card piecing some universe things together, and you just having that aha moment looking at something in the card game when you were maybe previously invested in the tabletop RPG. When you bring up like this getting your mind sort of lost in the mechanics, that's also something I was going for with the tabletop RPG. We'll get to that more in the mechanics video, but this tension that I'm trying to balance in the RPG is I want it to be like really approachable. So one of the I guess criticisms about older school D&D was that it often wasn't very approachable because it had like such expansive, difficult mechanics, and you had to sort of be a crunchy mechanics person to be interested in it. So what I'm trying to balance when I design this game is really that tension of I want it to be approachable. You can just jump in and create a character and go. If you have a character concept, it should be easy to build a character just like based on the story concept, and you don't have to worry too much about the mechanics. But if you are a more mechanically focused person, there's enough here for you to chew on, and you can actually think about how to build an interesting mechanical character and spend time thinking about the universe in that way of like, I want to build a fighter with abilities like around fighting with like specific sword styles and combine these things. Like that should also be a legitimate way to engage with the RPG mechanically.
Yeah, I think, is that about everything that we had here?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so join the Discord. Stay tuned here. We will be making some different like world building kind of lore or narrative videos here, whether it is kind of like audio book style short stories, or we've got a few somewhat out there concepts that we're gonna maybe try doing, and we'll see how that goes. But we would like to, even before the games are really done, just get some of this stuff out there onto the internet for people to start enjoying, and YouTube is really a great way to do that. I mean, I just like making YouTube videos and sitting in DaVinci Resolve editing, so, I mean, we'll see how this goes. I think it's pretty fun. It's just one of the things I like doing, and I'm gonna do it with this now.
Yeah, and on my end, like, this is not something that I'm going to be losing interest in soon. It's a passion project that I've been working on for like over 6 years now, and I'm finally ready to like start showing it to people, I guess. And if this gets popular, if it doesn't get popular, it's going to be something I'm going to keep building for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'm interested in helping more with the world building at this point. I've been rather focused with the card game mechanics for some time now, but I've got a bit more time now to maybe help putting my own effort into the lore itself and creating my own stuff within it. And I'm not terribly experienced with that kind of thing, but I'm going to give it a try and hopefully it'll go well.
Yeah, and I mean, that's sort of the fun of all of this, right? Is that it's meant to be kind of like a backdrop for you to put your own imaginings on. So even if this is maybe your first time, like, getting interested in like building something in a tabletop RPG world, don't worry about it too much. Shoot some ideas. Like, it really is just a sort of fun, relaxing thing to do once you get involved in like kind of telling these kinds of collaborative stories.
Yeah, so thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you either on Discord or the next time, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.